Hi there, and welcome once again to the Joe Roberts podcast. The title of today's podcast is How to Deal with Extremism, brackets, far right versus far left. I've made a few videos recently on this subject. First off, I did a podcast about the aftermath of the Southport incident when there was riots, and those riots developed into clashes between the far right and the far left. And then I did another podcast called Hate Creates More Hate, and this is kind of around similar lines. The reason being that, as I'm sure everyone can agree, it's cropping up more and more in our world right now. So I decided I wanted to make a podcast with some insights about this subject that I think will be useful to people. So in the aftermath of those riots, or around the same time that it was going on, I had a discussion with somebody about this, and they kind of said a similar thing to what a Labour MP had said in the aftermath of those riots. This Labour MP made some comments more or less advocating for violence against those who have far-right political views, and it was very sort of graphic violence, and he clearly felt justified in saying this. And the person that I was talking to was kind of a similar view, and they had also made some flippant but very aggressive remark about how they considered that it was acceptable to sort of deal with people on the far right of the political spectrum with acts of extreme violence. And I think that there's quite a lot of people in our society who have this kind of viewpoint. Their viewpoint is kind of, well, they're hateful people, so it's okay to deal with them on a hateful level, and it's okay to sort of address the problem that they present society with on a similar level by, maybe carrying out acts of violence against them. This isn't something which I agree with, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this podcast. So it very quickly developed into clashes between the far right and the far left, and I don't differentiate to any great degree between those two seemingly polarised perspectives. The very far left and the very far right of the political spectrum are, in my opinion, much of a muchness. They argue for different things. So on the far left, you may have extreme conservatism, or you may have fascism even, and then on the extreme left, you actually have sort of such a sort of overzealous representation of communism and other left-wing ideologies that it actually starts to resemble fascism. So it's kind of like if the political spectrum were like a circle, it almost goes like full circle where far left and far right actually meet. And this is part of the problem, because the two polarities are meeting each other on the same level, and it's causing nothing but problems for everyone. So when I was having this sort of discussion with this person, it turned quite heated, and I actually became quite impassioned about it as well, although I was saying, well, it's not really the right approach to do this, and the person wasn't listening to me, and I became quite annoyed about it, and I said to them, well, how does responding to violence with violence help the problem? And it became quite heated, and we had to part company. But one of the things that they did say to me during that discussion, which was quite a good question, was, well, how would you deal with it then? So if you have these people rioting in the streets, these so-called far-right extremists, and they have extreme views, and they're doing extreme things, which they were, what is the best way to deal with that? And in the sort of period of time since I had that discussion and now, I did actually have some insight into that subject. And, I get my insights in a sort of a spiritual sense. I can do channeling and stuff like that. So my insights, I have a great deal of faith in them, and I hope that at some point others will as well. So I'm going to share some of those insights. And the first one, and it's very acute, and it's kind of the entire crux of this podcast, so I would like anybody that is listening to this to hear what I'm about to say, and take this very much to heart, because you will scarcely hear better advice than this. You cannot solve a problem on the same level of consciousness that created it. That is absolutely paramount to this entire issue. You cannot solve a problem on the same level of consciousness that created it. So if you respond to hatred with anything resembling hatred, you will get more hatred. Now, I know that's kind of repetition of what I was talking about in my last podcast, but I'm going to go into some examples which are part of my insight in order to illustrate the point better, because I feel that it bears repeating. So where the far left is concerned, there is almost an attitude of entitlement to, as they see it, deal with people who are on the far right with as much aggression and hatred as they can possibly muster. And there is an attitude of entitlement towards this. The attitude is one of, well, they're just a bunch of Nazis anyway, so it's okay to abuse them, or they're just a bunch of Nazis anyway, so it's okay if you rough them up and commit acts of violence against them and just generally treat them like they're beneath consideration. And I'm telling you that that approach will not work. So part of my insight is that if you keep approaching aspects of the collective unconscious like this, aspects of the human shadow like this, and you keep approaching very extreme viewpoints with this attitude of, just throw it in the bin, just cast it aside, just throw it away because it's garbage, just force these people underground, just force them to be silent, and just keep throwing them away like unwanted garbage. If you keep adopting that approach, what happens is it stagnates. Now, I have seen examples of this in my own life, so I know what I am talking about. I'm not talking about personal experience. I have met somebody who was very extreme in their views, and I'll be talking about that person a lot. It was somebody who had a history of crime, and I learned a lot from talking to this person. And this person had a history of extremism and extreme views, and what had happened was they hadn't been listened to. And when you don't listen to somebody who has extreme views and you keep giving them the message, you're not worth listening to, go away, then what happens is those views get more and more and more toxic, and they start to fester, and they get worse and worse and worse. So I am telling you that if our society keeps adopting this approach towards those on the far right, that problem is going to get worse. I hope whoever is listening to this podcast hears that and takes seriously what I am about to say, because I have literally seen that dynamic at work, and I have seen what the result is of approaching something that is extreme from that angle. Those on the far left are not doing anything remotely useful in their approach to dealing with those on the far right. Their approach is going to make the situation worse, because they are operating on the same level of consciousness. It is one of hatred. They approach those on the far right with hatred, and if you meet hatred with hatred, it will create more. This is a continuation of what I was talking about in the last podcast. I'm going to give other examples now. This was another thing which I learned from the individual that I was just talking about. There are different expressions of hatred, so I'm going to cover a couple of those right now to give you a more acute understanding of how this works. So in the first example, you could be talking about somebody who had experiences of abuse. Somebody who had, for example, been abused in childhood. So this expression of hatred goes something like, I was abused, therefore I am entitled to abuse others. That is the sort of ethos of it. Now, obviously you can hear that it doesn't work, it's not true, and it's not going to help the person or the society in which they're living, but this is a thing. In very extreme cases, a person can take on this outlook and they become exactly what they despise. So it's like a split develops in the person's consciousness. So on the one hand, they despise the person that abused them, but on the other hand, they start to identify with the abuse and they take on the characteristics of the abuser and they start to feel entitled to abuse others. Then you have a response to that from the society in which the person is living, or from the individuals around them, and that is one of, you are not behaving in a social way, you are behaving in an extremely antisocial way, you're behaving in a criminal way, a reprehensible way, you are an abuser, therefore we are entitled to abuse you. That's the second kind of hatred. The two energies cancel each other out. Remember what I said earlier in the podcast. You can't solve a problem on the same level of consciousness that created it. The second expression of hatred, which causes so much problems in our society, is you've behaved badly, therefore you've ceased to have any rights as a human being and you're now beneath consideration as a human being, so I'm entitled to abuse you. This is what you're looking at on the world stage where so-called far right and so-called far left are concerned. That's the two energies that you're looking at here, broadly speaking. And in a sort of individual expression, you could look at it through the lens of what I've just been talking about. Somebody that was abused, who then goes on to abuse others, so society thinks it's okay to abuse them. Nothing gets solved if you keep approaching things from that angle. So what does it take to address this? Well, my insights have led me to believe that listening is one of the most important things that there is here. Now, I know that there are lots of people in our society who will recoil at the idea of listening to those on the far right, but I am telling you with certainty that that is what is going to be required in order to address that particular problem. And the same probably applies where crime is concerned as well. Unless we get to a point as a society where we are prepared to start listening to the quote-unquote bad guys and the so-called bad guys of the world, we're never going to resolve that particular issue. That particular problem is never going to be solved, because if we keep adopting the approach of they're not worth listening to, we shouldn't be listening to them, they need to just go away and die quietly somewhere, the issue is never going to be resolved. Listening and presence. Being present with somebody, hearing what they have to say, listening to them express themselves, listening to them express their truth. And by the way, can I just say here, and I'm going to underline this point, there's a difference between listening to somebody with presence and agreeing with everything that they have to say. You do not have to agree with somebody's views in order to afford them the consideration of being listened to. They're not the same thing. Our society can create a space for people to express themselves without condoning their views. You can vociferously disagree with their views, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't listen to them. This is what it's going to take. And I am telling you that if our society doesn't get a handle on this, these extreme individuals with extreme political views in all different respects, it's going to get worse and worse. People need to be listened to. Everybody needs to be listened to. That's universal. It's part of the makeup of our species that we need to be listened to as people. And that's part of this issue, and it's part of this conflict between sort of far right and far left. The far left are part of the prevailing orthodoxy now in Western society, so we don't need to apply this to them, because it's not that they're not being listened to, they're part of the prevailing orthodoxy. We don't need to afford them that. They are the norm. They have been built into the sort of prevailing orthodoxy of Western society, leftist political views. It's the far right that are being marginalised, and you don't have to agree with what they represent and what they believe in order to listen to them. And listening is what should be happening. That's what's going to happen, and it has to happen sooner or later. Otherwise, the problem is going to get worse and worse. We can't afford to keep marginalising certain groups in society, or they're going to become more and more extreme. That is how the collective unconscious works. And we also need to apply the same principle to crime as well. So those who have committed even violent crimes, they need to be listened to as well. That has to be part of the rehabilitation of criminals in our society, that people have to be listened to. We have to be willing to let people talk and let people speak their truth, even if it sounds very ugly to our ears. And I'll just underline the point again, that doesn't mean agreeing with people when they're expressing extreme views. I find very far right views repugnant, and I also find a lot of what the far left are standing for nowadays quite repugnant as well. I look for balance in as many areas of my life as possible, so extremism is not the way. These are a few insights that I wanted to share as regards how to deal with extremism. I know that they will not be to everyone's taste, but I do think that in the bigger picture they will work. And I think if you show somebody, the vast majority of human beings, if not all, I think if you show them the consideration of being listened to, and you actually tell them and give them the message, you're worth listening to even though I don't agree with you in any way, shape or form, I think the vast majority of human beings will respond positively to that. And I think that's what it's going to take to turn extremism around in our society. I hope that this has given you some food for thought. Bye for now, and thanks for listening.